On March 12, 2019, the town of Elmswood woke up like any other ordinary day. A small place, surrounded by quiet woods, narrow streets, and familiar faces, where everyone swore nothing truly serious could happen. It was the kind of town where doors were rarely locked, and local gossip revolved around school parties or youth baseball tournaments. But that day, something completely shattered this routine of security and revealed a truth so dark no one could have imagined. A group of officers, accompanied by volunteer firefighters, discovered a warehouse that for decades had been treated as nothing more than an old, useless building, almost part of the forgotten landscape. What they found inside not only shocked the community, but also shook the entire country. The initial shock came with the heavy smell of damp, rusty iron and eerie silence, that silence that seems to scream louder than any noise. Inside the structure, there were signs of something amiss: reinforced internal gates, makeshift corridors, bars and locks that made no sense for an abandoned building. And then, when a door was finally broken down, the eyes of everyone present never forgot what they saw. Children, dozens of them, then hundreds, frightened looks, frail bodies, some barely able to react to the light that entered for the first time in years. It was as if that place had swallowed the innocence of an entire generation. No one in Elmswood knew that beneath their feet lay a veritable underground hell. No one suspected that behind the facades of a quiet town lay dark corridors, hiding stories of pain, isolation, and survival. What shocked the community most was realizing that these children weren't the result of a single disappearance, but rather years of accumulated cases, some so old they had already been considered closed without a solution. The discovery wasn't just about captivity, but about the revelation that something much larger and more organized was happening in front of everyone, without anyone noticing. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is to think that if it weren't for one seemingly trivial detail, none of this would have come to light, and those children would remain trapped in the darkness, forgotten by everyone. It's impossible to hear a story like this and not feel a knot in your stomach. You, who are here now, know the weight of delving into cases full of mystery, pain, and twists that no one imagines. It's this attentive gaze, this desire to understand what really happened, that makes you part of a unique community, one that doesn't let these voices disappear into silence. Here we relive every detail, expose every flaw, every hidden truth, and give stories the chance to be told as they truly were. So come with us, because this is just the beginning. Like the video and subscribe to the channel right now to be part of this journey where every revelation matters. Rebecca Collins was no ordinary woman. At 42, the FBI agent had dedicated nearly half her life to delving into investigations that many colleagues avoided, especially those involving missing children. From the outside, she saw only a cold, obstinate professional, always with a straight face and eyes that rarely blinked during an interrogation. But what no one knew, and what she did everything to hide, was that behind her rigid demeanor lay an open wound that never healed. Years before, her son Daniel, just 7 years old, disappeared under circumstances never explained. It was an ordinary summer afternoon. He was playing in the backyard and simply vanished. No witnesses, no concrete leads, nothing but emptiness. From that day on, Rebecca swore she would never again let another child be forgotten the way her son was. This oath shaped her career, her relationships, and most importantly, the way she approached each case. She no longer had a personal life in the conventional sense. The divorce came soon after Daniel's disappearance. Her husband, unable to bear the pain and her growing obsession with finding answers, eventually distanced himself. Her few remaining friends also lost their way, tired of trying to rescue her from herself. Rebecca threw herself headfirst into her work, as if each case that arose was a desperate attempt to somehow bring her son back. This made her extremely competent, but also a target of internal criticism. Many colleagues called her paranoid, saying she saw non-existent connections, that she pushed baseless investigations. However, those who worked closely with her knew that despite her difficult demeanor, Rebecca was rarely wrong. In early 2019, when the disappearance of the three Miller brothers reached her, most agents treated it as something trivial, perhaps a runaway, perhaps parental neglect, nothing that required a complex investigation. But Rebecca sensed something different. She said the silence of that case seemed to echo the same silence as the night she lost Daniel. It was a detail almost invisible to others. But to her, something was off. And this intuition, which had saved lives so many times, was the starting point for one of the greatest discoveries of her career. Rebecca was usually methodical in her habits, and this was part of her secret. She kept personal investigation journals where she cross-referenced information on seemingly unrelated disappearances. Scribbled maps, dates, old photos of children, everything was carefully stored, like pieces of a puzzle that only she seemed to see. In the Miller case, she not only noticed a repeating pattern, but also identified that all the recent disappearances had occurred within a 20-kilometer radius of a disused railroad. To many, a coincidence. To Rebecca, a glaring clue. This kind of reasoning was what made her both respected and feared. Some admired her courage, and others thought she simply used work as an excuse to avoid facing her grief head-on. But the truth is, her motivation always ran deeper. It was as if with each case she could somehow get closer to the answer she so desperately sought about her own son. Daniel's face, smiling in a yellowed photo on the shelf in her home, was the constant reminder that drove her toward each new abyss. That week in March, Rebecca was more tired than ever. Sleep was almost non-existent, and coffee had become more of an addiction than a habit. Even so, when she received the call from teacher Susan Miller reporting the disappearance of her 3 children at once, she didn't hesitate. She dropped everything and went to Elmswood herself. What she found was a town frightened, yet incredulous. The residents spoke in hushed tones, as if the matter were a curse that could spread just by mentioning it. The local police, led by Sheriff Thompson, treated it as a domestic matter. Rebecca, however, looked into the children's mother's eyes and saw the same pain she once reflected in the mirror. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't neglect. It was kidnapping. She was sure of it. But life didn't allow her certainties without consequences. With every step, with every word, Rebecca carried the shadow of judgment. Many said she projected her son's case onto each new disappearance, that her personal pain blinded her. But perhaps it was precisely this open wound that gave her the sensitivity to perceive what others didn't. It was a mixture of obsession and instinct, and that's what kept her going when everyone around her had given up. Elmswood seemed too peaceful to hide secrets, and perhaps that was precisely why it was the perfect place to cover up horrors. The abandoned warehouse had been there for so long that no one questioned its presence. People passed by it daily, never imagining what lay beneath the concrete. Rebecca didn't yet know the full extent of what she was about to discover, but something inside her told her that this town held greater answers than anyone could imagine. And the seemingly trivial detail that caught her attention was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would change everything. That same week, while the town of Elmswood was still buzzing about the disappearance of the 3 Miller brothers, Rebecca began to notice something that everyone else missed. She'd always believed that big answers lie in the small details, and this case was no different. Amid the confusing testimonies, hasty reports from local police, and the sheriff's insistence on treating everything as a voluntary escape, there was one thing that didn't add up: the timing. The children's mother claimed she'd dropped her children off at 7 in the morning before going to work, and when she returned at 4 in the afternoon, she found no sign of them. Doors locked from the inside, windows intact, no sign of forced entry. It was as if they'd simply vanished. Rebecca became obsessed with this detail. How could 3 children disappear without a trace in the space of just a few hours? It was impossible for there to be nothing. And then she noticed a missing piece of information on a secondary page of the police report. An elderly neighbor with a history of memory lapses had mentioned hearing strange noises around 10 in the morning. The police immediately dismissed it, deeming the witness unreliable. But for Rebecca, this was the first crack in the official narrative. She knew that fragile witnesses, precisely because they are ignored, often hold the most important pieces of the puzzle. She decided to visit the scene on her own. She walked through the miller's house, exploring each room, noting the details no one had bothered to record. On the kitchen table, she found 3 glasses still filled with juice, half empty, the liquid already curdled. Everything indicated the children had been home shortly before they disappeared. Surveying the surroundings, she noticed strange marks in the yard, as if a truck's tires had been pressed into the damp grass. The police hadn't collected this trace. To Rebecca, it sounded like a clear signature. Someone had been there, someone prepared, someone who knew what they were doing. What intrigued her most was realizing that this pattern of silent disappearances had occurred in other old cases she'd studied. Children who disappeared with no sign of a struggle, no solid witnesses at seemingly unlikely times. Everything fit together, and yet no one but her saw the connection. It was the kind of detail that separated a cold report from a real investigation. To the police, it was just another troubled family. To Rebecca, it was the tip of a thread that, if pulled hard enough, could reveal a much larger tangle. And it was precisely this perception, this keen instinct for seemingly trivial things, that led her to realize that the Miller brothers weren't just missing. They had been taken in a calculated manner by hands that had long been acting unnoticed. The problem was that the more Rebecca connected these dots, the more she realized she was alone in this search. But it would be impossible to ignore what was beginning to unfold before her, because that seemingly small clue was about to reveal a hidden pattern that would forever change her understanding of the case. Rebecca didn't believe in coincidences, never had. To her, coincidences were just loose pieces of a puzzle no one bothered to put together, and it was precisely this reasoning that kept her awake for nights, leafing through old reports, forgotten maps in dusty archives, and yellowed newspaper clippings that almost no one remembered anymore. The Miller brothers' disappearances weren't an isolated case. They were connected to something much larger. And the connection was there, hidden in numbers, dates, and places that seemed to have nothing in common at first glance. She spread all the files around the living room of her small house in Arlington. There were open folders on the sofa, maps scribbled in colored markers on the dining table, and photographs of missing children tacked to a corkboard. On the wall, each face looked up at her like a silent plea for justice. Rebecca began marking the places where each child had disappeared. Soon, she realized that most of the cases were located in small towns, almost always near some disused train line or abandoned warehouse. This couldn't be a coincidence. She remembered something her instructor had said in her early years at the FBI. Criminals choose escape routes before they choose victims. It came back to her with a vengeance. And looking at the maps, Rebecca understood. The locations chosen weren't random, they were strategic points. The pattern lay hidden in something everyone ignored. Alongside each disappearance, there was always a forgotten route, an abandoned building, or an underground space beyond the reach of regular police. And the decommissioned railroad that ran through Elmswood was the most glaring link. While official reports treated each case as independent, Rebecca began connecting the dots. In 2007, 2 children went missing in a town just 20 miles away. In 2011, 4 more vanished without a trace. In 2015, 3 siblings were declared runaways after the family car was found abandoned near a barn. And now, in 2019, the Millers. Every 4 years, a new set of disappearances emerged. The almost regular interval seemed not a random pattern, but rather a kind of macabre timeline. Rebecca knew she was treading on dangerous ground. No one within the agency wanted to hear about unproven connections. The Elmswood sheriff, least of all. To him, she was forcing coincidences and using her own trauma to see monsters where there were none. But she couldn't ignore it. The files screamed at her. Routes intersected, locations repeated, and with each mark on the map, the circle closed around Elmswood. One early morning, after hours of sleeplessness, Rebecca drove alone to the disused railway. The night chill bit her skin, and the wind whistled through the dry trees. She walked along the tracks, using only a small flashlight, and noticed fresh marks on the ground. Vehicles had passed by, even though access had been officially closed for decades. She continued until she reached the abandoned warehouse, a grey building that looked ready to collapse, but up close showed strange signs of maintenance, new chains on the gate, recently replaced locks, even boot prints on the dirt floor. Who would care for a building doomed to oblivion? Her heart was pounding. She knew she had no warrant, no backup, and no way to enter without attracting attention. But she also knew she was facing something big. She took quick photos, recorded videos, and returned home with the nagging feeling that she was getting closer and closer to something that could destroy not only her career, but also her very safety. In the following days, he delved even deeper into the files. He discovered that many of the families of the missing children had reported strange movements near warehouses or abandoned buildings. Some spoke of unmarked trucks passing by in the early hours of the morning. Others heard muffled sounds like screams, which were never investigated. All of these reports had been dismissed by the local police as unfounded. It was as if someone had worked hard to maintain the invisible pattern, covering up every piece of evidence, suppressing every suspicion. Rebecca knew she was about to go to war not only against criminals, but also against the system itself. The truth is, most authorities didn't want to believe something so massive and terrifying was happening right under their noses. To admit this would be to admit irreparable failures, to admit that hundreds of children had been taken without anyone having done anything. Therefore, it was always more convenient to treat each disappearance as an isolated case, a domestic tragedy, a cruel stroke of bad luck. But she couldn't think that way. Every dot on the map was a life. Every face on the corkboard was a stolen childhood. For her, there was no room for coincidence, only for action. And the more she looked at that pattern, the more certain she became that the Miller brothers weren't alone. They were part of a network, a sequence, a macabre game that had been going on for over a decade without anyone having the courage to confront it. Deep down, Rebecca knew she was going too far, but at the same time, she couldn't stop. It was like being pulled into a dark labyrinth where each corridor revealed more connections. With each discovery, the feeling grew that she was close to something immense, but also the fear that this proximity could cost her dearly. And when she looked back at the map, with all the marked lines converging on Elmswood, she understood that the thread she had been pulling from the beginning wasn't just forming a pattern. It pointed directly to the place where everything would explode. When Rebecca presented her preliminary findings to Sheriff Mark Thompson, the room seemed to freeze. The man, accustomed to commanding Elmswood's small police force with absolute authority, looked at her as if she were a lunatic. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and dismissively said that there was nothing there but paranoia. Rebecca persisted. She showed him the maps, the dates, the records of old disappearances that connected to the Miller case, but Thompson just laughed, claiming she was letting her personal traumas taint the trial. To him, it was just another poorly explained disappearance, nothing to warrant a federal outcry. The conflict flared there. Rebecca knew she wouldn't have the support of the local police. The entire town trusted the sheriff, and anything that contradicted him was seen as an exaggeration or an attempt to attract attention. He was a typical leader who preferred to maintain the appearance of order rather than face the grim reality. Admitting that something so serious was happening under his watch meant tarnishing his own career, exposing serious flaws, and facing the fury of a population that had always believed itself protected. For Thompson, it was easier to silence Rebecca than to face the truth. She left the police station with a knot in her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd experienced years before, when she'd begged for help with her son's disappearance and received only empty promises and poorly written reports. The system had failed her in the past, and now it was failing her again. But this time, the victims weren't. Just 3 children, but dozens, perhaps hundreds. Rebecca felt helplessness mingling with anger. She was facing an authority figure who refused to listen, who preferred to ignore the facts to maintain the illusion of normalcy. In the following weeks, the tension only increased. Each time he tried to obtain authorization to investigate the abandoned warehouse, his request was denied. Thompson pleaded lack of evidence, saying there was no reason to mobilize resources, and saying he wouldn't turn Elmswood into a stage for mass hysteria. He even hinted that if Rebecca persisted in pressing the issue, he would report her conduct to FBI headquarters as inappropriate behavior. The threat was not veiled. It was clear that his intention was to isolate her, discredit her, and, if possible, permanently remove her from the investigation. Rebecca felt trapped. She was alone in a city that seemed more concerned with protecting its reputation than its children. The victims' families had no voice, treated as attention seekers or irresponsible parents. Official reports were riddled with gaps, and any concrete leads were quickly dismissed. The more she tried to speak out, the more she was perceived as the disturbed agent who couldn't separate her personal life from her work. And this hurt her in a particular way because she knew some of this criticism was true. She truly couldn't separate Daniel's disappearance from the pain of other families. But was that weakness? For her, it was the opposite. It was the only thing that gave her the strength to carry on. The biggest shock came when she discovered that some of the evidence she had collected had simply disappeared from the sheriff's office files. The photos of the tire tracks in the miller's yard were missing. Residents' reports of trucks driving around in the early hours of the morning were never formally recorded. When she questioned them, they said it must have been an administrative error. For Rebecca, it was impossible. Not to see something worse, someone was actively covering up the case. It wasn't just negligence, it was manipulation. And if the sheriff himself was involved, the web of silence might run even deeper than she imagined. The conflict with the local authorities became a constant obstacle. Rebecca felt like every step toward the truth was blocked by an invisible barrier erected by the system. It was as if she was screaming inside a closed room where no one could hear her. And the more she tried to break through this barrier, the stronger the pressure to give up. The isolation was suffocating. In quiet moments, she wondered if she really was going crazy, if perhaps Thompson was right and she was just projecting her trauma onto unrelated cases. But all she had to do was look at the board with the children's faces to understand she wasn't wrong. The pattern was real, the connections existed, and ignoring it would be a death sentence for the Millers and so many other invisible victims. The town of Elmswood, with its peaceful facade of a close-knit community, was beginning to reveal a dark side. The authorities' disregard wasn't just bureaucratic, it was almost complicit. And Rebecca felt deep down that time was running out. Every day of inaction was another day those children could be trapped somewhere, waiting for a rescue that might never come. The problem was that to act, she would need to break through the official barrier, risk her career and perhaps even her life. And as She stared at the walls of the police station, listening to the sheriff's cold denials. She realized there was no going back from the decision that lay ahead. Rebecca spent days mulling over the same question: what to do when the system that should protect children insists on turning a blind eye. This doubt consumed her almost physically, as if each denial from Sheriff Thompson were another weight on her shoulders. However, what seemed like an insurmountable barrier also served as fuel. Each time she was disbelieved, the memory of Daniel surged even more strongly in her mind, as if he himself were urging her not to give up. And then, amidst the frustration, came the decision that would change everything. Rebecca decided to go it alone. It wasn't an impulsive act, as many might think. It was a rational, painful, but inevitable choice. She knew that continuing to rely on local authorities meant watching the case slowly die, like so many others before it. So she marshaled her own resources. She used old contacts who still trusted her competence, secretly called trusted colleagues within the FBI to gain access to internal reports, and most importantly, devised a personal plan to investigate Elmswood without relying on the sheriff's approval. It was risky, but it was her only chance. Nights became silent journeys. Rebecca grew accustomed to watching the warehouse from afar, parking her car in strategic spots and using binoculars to observe any movement. She saw trucks, with no official license plates, passing along the abandoned railroad at odd hours. She noticed men unloading heavy boxes and entering the side of the building, as if it were routine. Everything indicated that the warehouse was not abandoned, but active and functioning as part of something larger. Every observation was recorded in detail in her notebooks. Rebecca no longer trusted anyone but herself to leave evidence. The isolation began to take its toll. With each passing day, she distanced herself further from everything that might remind her of an ordinary life. The unanswered messages on her cell phone, the missed calls from a sister trying to stay in touch, even the dog barking alone in the yard because it rarely received attention. Rebecca's personal life had already been torn apart years before, but now it seemed buried forever. There was only the investigation, only the missing children, only the search for answers. And it corroded her as much as it strengthened her. The risks increased as she delved deeper. On one of these nights of vigil, she realized she wasn't the only one watching. A black car parked not far away with no visible license plates and remained idle for hours, its headlights off. Rebecca pretended not to notice, but her heart raced. Had they already noticed her presence? Was someone watching her, ready to silence her before she went too far? It was at that moment that she understood she was entering territory from which there was no return. Even so, he didn't back down. On the contrary, he intensified his research. He searched old warehouse records and discovered that the property had passed through several hands over the years, each through shell companies that went bankrupt within months. All linked to different names, but with similar accounting standards. It was a scheme to hide the true owner, someone with the money, influence and power to remain invisible. For Rebecca, this confirmed that she wasn't dealing with common criminals, but with an organized network that had been operating for years, perhaps decades, under everyone's noses. The emotional toll was brutal. She began to suffer from frequent nightmares, in which she saw her son trapped in one of the underground corridors, calling out to her in the darkness. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, and immediately return to the archives, as if work were the only way to silence the voices of memory. The grief she had never overcome mingled with the present, making it impossible to separate her personal pain from her professional mission. And deep down, that was what drove her. Every step she took outside the rules brought her closer to an abyss. Rebecca knew that if she were caught investigating without authorization, her FBI career could end there. But the alternative was worse, letting the Millers and so many other children disappear forever into the indifference of a broken system. So she chose to risk everything. It was a lonely, heavy decision, but also inevitable. She chose to carry the burden of being the only voice still believing those children were alive and waiting for help. One of those early mornings, standing in front of the corkboard covered in faces, Rebecca felt a mixture of fear and determination. The silence of the house contrasted with the weight of the photos staring back at her. Children who never returned home, families destroyed, lives cut short. And now, the Millers, the emptiness in her mother. Susan's eyes was the same emptiness she knew intimately, and it was there, alone in the dim light of the living room, that she swore to herself she would not let history repeat itself. She knew she was alone against an invisible enemy, but she also knew she had already gone too far to retreat. The decision was made, and the next step would be riskier than all the previous ones because it would require facing not only her fears and memories, but also an antagonist who, until that moment, had remained in the shadows. The price of this solitary decision began to show all too quickly, and Rebecca felt it in her body and mind. The weeks of vigil outside the warehouse, the sleepless nights, the coffees piling up on the table next to old reports and photos, it all took its toll. She would wake with chest pains, her heart racing for no apparent reason, as if on constant alert. The FBI team doctor had warned in previous reports about anxiety attacks and symptoms of post-traumatic stress, but Rebecca ignored it. She believed that stopping would be tantamount to betraying all those children whose faces watched her silently from the classroom's corkboard. The isolation was also cruel. No one in Elmswood supported her. Sheriff Thompson spread the story that she was out of her mind, and soon residents began treating her like an inconvenient stranger. At the grocery store, suspicious glances followed her through the aisles. In cafes, conversation stopped when she entered. Even the parents of the missing children, desperate for answers, seemed hesitant to trust her fully, fearing reprisals from the sheriff and local authorities. Rebecca was alone on an invisible battlefield, surrounded by veiled hostility. And, as if that weren't enough, her personal life seemed to be falling apart completely. Her sister left worried messages. "You're not answering anymore, Rebecca. I'm scared of what you're doing." The dog, once her only companion, now spent hours howling in the yard. Forgotten, the divorce years before had already cut off any possibility of closer emotional support. All that remained was the memory of Daniel, which returned with every moment of weakness. In moments of exhaustion, she would close her eyes and see her son standing in the yard of their old house, looking at her with an expression that blended innocence and demand. Was it a hallucination? Perhaps, but it was what kept her going. Rebecca also began noticing strange signs that made her uneasy. More than once, driving down the highway, she noticed headlights behind her car that seemed to follow her for miles and then suddenly disappear. In a gas station parking lot, she found an anonymous note stuck to the windshield. "Come home before it's too late." It was impossible not to connect this to the research. The feeling of being watched haunted her, and the fear was no longer just for the case, but for her own life. The emotional toll was becoming increasingly evident in her appearance. Colleagues who saw her in passing at the FBI offices would whisper, "She's finished." Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale, her gaze ever distant. Rebecca knew she was on the verge of collapse, but she couldn't stop. The conviction that the Millers were still alive overpowered any instinct for self-preservation, and there was another weight that was beginning to accumulate, the feeling of helplessness in the face of constant failure. Every clue she uncovered was dismissed, every attempt to act was blocked. This left her in a state of pent-up rage, a silent fury that only grew. She wanted to scream, to expose the truth to everyone, but she knew that if she did so without irrefutable evidence, she would be dismissed for good. This dilemma gnawed at her. Act quickly and risk losing credibility, or wait longer and risk being too late to save the children. Loneliness turned into distrust. Rebecca no longer trusted anyone. She avoided sharing information even with trusted colleagues. fearing leaks or infiltrations that could compromise the investigation. She kept everything to herself, multiplying the pressure on her own shoulders. This made her more vulnerable, but at the same time, it reinforced the feeling that only she could lead the case. The biggest blow came when she received an anonymous email containing old photos of her son, Daniel, mixed with images of other missing children. The message was short and cruel. "He's just one of many." Rebecca broke down. She cried. Alone, silently, feeling her past and present intermingle in an endless cycle of pain. But at the same time, that cruelty lit a flame of revenge within her. If they were trying to intimidate her using the most painful memory of her life, it was because she was close to something important. It was because someone out there was afraid of what she might discover. These personal obstacles not only wore her down, but also forced her to transform. Rebecca was no longer just an agent seeking justice. She was slowly becoming a survivor of her own internal battle, someone willing to sacrifice anything to reach the truth. The weight was immense, but with each crisis, with each sleepless night, she silently reaffirmed the promise she had made to herself. No child would be forgotten. And it was in this state of fragility and strength at the same time that she began to perceive a new element in the case, something that until then had remained in the shadows, but that would soon show the true face of the evil that was stalking all those children. David Harper emerged in Rebecca's research almost discreetly, as true predators do. At first glance, he seemed the exact opposite of a suspect. A respected man in the community, a successful businessman, and the owner of a transportation network that employed dozens of Elmswood residents. He attended church on Sundays, donated to charity events, and was seen at local parties with a friendly smile that exuded confidence. Many described him as the backbone of the town, but Rebecca knew from the cold look behind that smile that something was deeply wrong. She began investigating him when she realized that Harper's company had warehouses and storage facilities scattered across strategic locations near the same abandoned train lines that had been reported missing. It was as if the company's infrastructure was tailor-made to move cargo without attracting attention. Cargo that, perhaps, wasn't just boxes and merchandise. By cross-checking financial records, she discovered that several subsidiaries linked to his name were short-lived, lasting only a few months and then being shut down. Always the same pattern: intense movement, quick closure, and reappearance under a different name. This type of behavior screamed fraud and money laundering, but Rebecca sensed something more, something much more sinister. What bothered her most was the contrast between the public figure and what appeared behind the scenes. In interviews with local newspapers, Harper spoke of family values, caring for the community, and investing in children's futures. He even organized donations for schools. However, old records revealed hushed-up cases involving missing drivers, accusations of harassment against young female employees that never reached court, and a history of business partnerships with companies suspected of involvement in international trafficking. It was as if he had constructed an image of an exemplary citizen precisely to cover up the enormity of his actions. Rebecca couldn't shake the idea that Harper was the central link in the child abduction ring, and the more she investigated, the more signs emerged. The locked gate of the warehouse she observed during nightly vigils was registered to a company that, behind it, led directly to his transportation network. The tire tracks in the miller's yard matched the model of the trucks used in his fleet. Even the times of the night shifts coincided with overtime shifts that were never officially reported in the accounting books. His psychological profile also drew attention. Rebecca requested the support of a criminal analyst to review the case confidentially, and the description she received was disturbing. Men like Harper don't present themselves as obvious monsters. On the contrary, they cultivate an image of normality to protect themselves. They have charisma, money, influence, and know how to manipulate those around them. But behind this facade lies an absolute moral void. They can laugh with friends at an elegant dinner and, hours later, order the transportation of victims as if they were merchandise. The banality of evil in its cruelest form. Rebecca remembered one night, watching from afar at a community event, when she saw Harper greeting children, handing out gifts, and posing for smiling photos alongside families. The scene seemed normal to everyone there, but to her it felt like a perverse irony. It was as if he reveled in the idea of being right in front of his own target, touching lives he could destroy at any moment. The ability to live at the center of the community while hiding such a shadowy network was what made his presence all the more terrifying. With each new piece of evidence, Rebecca felt the noose tighten, but she also sensed the growing danger. Harper wasn't just a criminal. He was someone protected by layers of influence. His name was in political campaigns, in local sponsorships, in donations to the police force. Attacking him meant attacking an entire system that depended on him, and this explained why Sheriff Thompson was so intent on discrediting any investigation that came close to him. Perhaps Thompson wasn't just negligent, but complicit. The weight of the discovery fell upon Rebecca like a shock. She wasn't dealing with an isolated kidnapping, but with a well-structured network led by someone hiding behind a smile and an impeccable reputation. And deep down, she knew the next step was inevitable, confronting the possibility that Harper was directly involved in the Miller's disappearance. But this confrontation wouldn't be simple, because messing with him meant entering a game where the rules were dictated by the enemy himself, someone already several steps ahead and who wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone who dared challenge him. Rebecca was already neck-deep in the investigation when the cruelest blow struck her personal life. Until then, she had treated the Miller case as an extension of the void left by Daniel, but at a certain point, the tragedy stopped being just a memory and knocked on her door again. Little Emily Johnson, Rebecca's neighbor, suddenly disappeared on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Emily was only 8 years old, the daughter of a nurse who lived alone and, by chance, spent a lot of time in Rebecca's care when her mother had to work night shifts. The little girl had become almost part of the family, bringing a rare light to the agent's lonely life. On the day of her disappearance, Rebecca had seen her in the morning, laughing in the backyard while playing with the dog. The memory of that laughter would echo like a torment, because a few hours later, Emily vanished without a trace. Doors locked, windows intact, no sign of a struggle. The same pattern that had haunted previous cases. The difference was that this time she wasn't just a face in a report, not a dusty old file. She was someone who was part of her routine, someone who called Rebecca Aunt Becca and sat on her living room couch watching cartoons. The news hit her like a punch in the gut. Despair was immediate. Rebecca ran through the entire neighborhood, calling the girl's name until her voice was lost, contacted her mother, and activated the few resources she could still use within the FBI. But the local police's reaction was the same as always: delays, disbelief, and empty phrases like, "Maybe she ran off to play somewhere else." Sheriff Thompson even suggested that Rebecca herself might be too emotionally involved, and that her closeness to the girl made her unobvious to conduct any investigation. This hurt her as never before, because it turned her pain into a weapon against her. For Rebecca, there was no doubt. Emily's disappearance was no coincidence. It was a message. She had gotten too close to the truth, had nudged a system that preferred to remain in the shadows, and now they were showing just how far they could go. The girl's abduction had two clear goals: to silence her and to break her emotionally, and for a moment it almost worked. Rebecca spent entire nights crying, unable to believe that life was ripping another child so close to her from her. But the pain soon turned into something stronger: rage. With each detail she analyzed, her certainty grew that Emily's disappearance bore the same signature as the other cases. Witnesses reported a dark van driving down the street hours earlier. A security camera captured the silhouette of a heavy vehicle, the same size as the trucks used by Harper's company. The pieces fit together cruelly, almost as if the enemy wanted her to notice. It was as if Harper were saying, "I know you're hunting me, and now I'm going to hunt you." This personal blow pushed Rebecca to her breaking point. The accumulated fatigue, the isolation, the veiled threats, everything seemed to multiply with Emily's absence. But at the same time, it was the turning point. If before she had been driven by Daniel's memory and the duty to protect the Millers, now the struggle became personal on a visceral level. Emily was no longer just another victim. She was part of her life, someone for whom she felt directly responsible. The thought of failing once again, of not saving the girl, was unbearable. With each passing day, the weight of her neighbor's disappearance pressed down on her, but it also kept her moving. Rebecca revisited the places where Emily used to play, trying to spot invisible clues. She drove down back roads looking for tire tracks. She called old contacts, asking for favors that could jeopardize her position at the FBI. She was willing to cross all ethical lines, to sacrifice everything, to bring Emily back. And it was in this whirlwind of pain and obsession that Rebecca realized something disturbing. The enemy knew exactly where to hit her. Her neighbor's disappearance wasn't just another tragedy. It was a calculated move to destroy her resistance. The question that echoed in her mind, night after night, was how far they were willing to go to keep her from the truth, and how far she herself would go to confront this web that had now definitively intertwined her life. Rebecca could no longer trust anyone. With every step she took, the feeling of being watched intensified, and the pressure of Emily's disappearance pushed her into an almost unbearable state of urgency. If before she had believed she was facing a well-structured enemy, now she was certain whoever had kidnapped the girl was leaving traces on purpose, as if to provoke her. The dark van, the tire tracks, the odd hours, everything seemed carefully calculated to be noticed by her, as if to say, "Continue, but know that we already know who you are." It was in this state of tension that Rebecca plunged into a desperate search. Using old maps of the city, she compared the disappearance locations with traffic records, discarded testimonies, and even reports from truck drivers who had passed through the area. Each line scribbled on the paper led her back to the same points: abandoned warehouses, disused railroads, and remote rural areas. Everything seemed to converge around an underground network, but there was no concrete evidence to support an official operation. Left with no choice, Rebecca began following her instincts. She scoured security cameras at local businesses, often without authorization, requesting footage as if for secondary investigations. In one, she spotted the dark van, turning toward the railroad tracks just hours before Emily disappeared. The license plate was blurry, but the vehicle's silhouette matched the smaller trucks used in David Harper's fleet. With each discovery, the line between intuition and proof became more blurred, but also clearer to her. The physical toll was brutal. Rebecca barely ate, slept only in short naps, and subsisted on coffee and medication to curb her anxiety attacks. But the pain was fuel. Emily's face, smiling in the backyard, days before appeared in flashes that propelled her forward. She roamed the city like a shadow, revisiting spots the police had ignored, interviewing residents who had given up talking, connecting each detail to a web that was beginning to take shape. At one point, while reconstructing Emily's steps, Rebecca found something that put her on high alert. In the alley behind a grocery store, there were barely visible drag marks on the ground, leading to a spot where the grass was flattened, as if a vehicle had parked there for a long time. It was the kind of evidence that could easily be dismissed as ordinary movement. But to her, it was just another piece of evidence. Someone had taken the girl deliberately, leaving no obvious trace, and had used alternate routes to disappear into the darkness. The search became an obsession. Rebecca began using tape, diagrams, and red lines to connect information on the board in the room. With each new piece of information, the puzzle became more ominous. The Millers, the old cases, Emily, they all pointed to the same underground corridors hidden beneath Elmswood. And as the pattern confirmed itself, a new anxiety grew within her, the possibility that time was running out. Desperation was evident even in her demeanor. Anyone who encountered her on the street saw a haggard woman with wrinkled clothes, red eyes, and the expression of someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But behind that appearance lay an almost unbreakable determination. Rebecca wasn't just searching for clues. She was racing against the clock, knowing that every hour lost could mean the difference between bringing Emily back alive or finding her too late. And it was during this silent marathon, amidst maps, cameras, and forgotten testimonies, that Rebecca realized how close she was to something too big to face alone. The desperate search was pushing her to the edge, but also to the brink of a revelation that could change not only the course of the investigation, but the very fate of the missing children. Rebecca was at her breaking point when she realized that every effort seemed to always run up against the same wall, the police themselves. Every time she presented solid evidence, every time she demonstrated a clear link between the disappearances, the response was the same: silence, disdain, or stifling bureaucracy. Sheriff Thompson had become almost a sworn enemy. He not only ignored the evidence, but also seemed intent on publicly discrediting her. At a press conference, he even said that some people insist on creating conspiracy theories based on family tragedies, a phrase clearly directed at her. This not only infuriated her, but also made her realize she was dealing with something bigger than simple negligence. Rebecca began to suspect that there were hidden agendas behind the sheriff's resistance. It made no sense to dismiss so much evidence, suppress witness reports, and even manipulate police records. It was as if someone were deliberately creating a smokescreen to protect the real culprits. And every time she got closer to an answer, a new frustration arose, pushing her back to square one. The height of this tension came when, exhausted, Rebecca took a dossier to the police department containing all the connections she had found. Maps, dates, vehicle movements, company records linked to Harper. She believed that with so much material gathered, it would no longer be possible to ignore it. But, instead of an operation, she received another humiliation. Thompson looked at the stack of documents and, with unnerving calm, said, "I can't waste resources on coincidences." The contempt was so intense that Rebecca felt her blood boil. That night, back home, she realized that some of the copies she had left at the police station had not returned. Someone had disappeared with specific reports, precisely the ones linking Harper to the properties near the railroad. Frustration turned to despair. It wasn't just negligence, it was active sabotage. They were erasing her findings before they could surface, trying to bury her along with the truth. This constant blockage made her feel like a disposable piece in a rigged game. With every attempt to play by the rules, she was pushed out of them. And as her anger grew, so did her sense of powerlessness. Rebecca had experience, instinct, and determination, but alone against a corrupt system, how far could she advance before being silenced? Forever. It was in this dilemma that her frustration became even more unbearable. She knew Emily and the Millers were somewhere, alive, waiting for help. But the police, instead of fighting the real enemy, were fighting her. With each closed door, each missing piece of evidence, the question grew more agonizing. How long could she go on without support before the network she was trying to expose swallowed her whole? Just when Rebecca was beginning to believe she was completely alone, something unexpected happened. Amidst the suffocating silence of denial, a small rift appeared. An investigative journalist named Michael Hayes, who worked for an independent news outlet, contacted her after hearing rumors about her investigation. Hayes was no ordinary reporter. He had a history of confronting corrupt officials and had been sued and threatened countless times for exposing scandals no one else dared touch. His arrival brought Rebecca a spark of hope, but also of distrust. After all, trusting someone at that moment could mean putting her life in the wrong hands. Their first conversation took place in a discreet cafe on the road connecting Elmswood to the neighboring town. Hayes arrived with a briefcase full of notes, as if already prepared to prove he wasn't just another curious observer. He explained that he'd been tracking suspicious movements in Harper's transportation network for months, but had never found concrete evidence. He also said he'd received anonymous reports from truckers about live cargo being transported on overnight routes, but whenever he tried to publish anything, he was pressured to file it away. For Rebecca, hearing this was like confirming everything she'd already suspected. She wasn't delusional, it wasn't paranoia. There was truly something much bigger going on. Besides Hayes, another unexpected source of support came from a group of volunteer firefighters from Elmswood. Two of them had heard about Rebecca's nightly vigils near the warehouse and decided to offer their assistance. At first, she declined. She didn't want to involve innocent people in something so dangerous, but their determination made her reconsider. One of them, named Paul, revealed that he had seen strange movements near the decommissioned railroad and had even tried to report it, but the sheriff dismissed it. The firefighters had access to rescue equipment, adapted vehicles, and, most importantly, they knew hidden routes through the city that could serve as shortcuts or escape routes. With these new allies, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. She was no longer fighting alone. For the first time, the information she'd kept to herself began to gain collective power. Hayes brought documents that reinforced Harper's financial connections, and the firefighters showed her old underground maps, indicating tunnels that ran directly beneath the warehouse. Everything seemed to be converging on the same point. Still, Rebecca remained cautious. The alliance was unexpected and fragile, built on distrust, but there was something undeniable. Alone, she would no longer be able to move forward. Emily's disappearance, the miller's burden, and the constant police sabotage were pushing her toward the abyss. Now, for the first time, there was a real chance to face the enemy with more than just instinct and courage. And deep down, she knew this reinforcement was not only welcome, but essential. Because if she was right, and she felt it in every fiber of her being, what they would find beneath that warehouse would be far greater and more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. The night of March 22, 2019 is etched in the memory of everyone who participated in that improvised operation. There were no official orders, no signed warrants, no systemic support. There was only the conviction that children were trapped somewhere, waiting for a rescue that might never come, and the courage of a small group willing to risk everything to bring them back. Rebecca, Michael Hayes, and the volunteer firefighters gathered in silence outside the abandoned warehouse. The air was heavy, as if even nature knew something terrible was about to happen there. The firefighters brought cutting tools, powerful flashlights, and breathing apparatus. Hayes carried cameras and recorders, determined to document every second, knowing that visual evidence would be the only way to prevent authorities from covering up the discovery. Rebecca, wearing a vest and a pistol hidden under her jacket, felt her heart race like it hadn't since the day she lost Daniel. But there was no room for hesitation. The main gate was locked with new, heavy chains. Paul, one of the firefighters, used hydraulic pliers to cut through the metal. The sound echoed loudly, but there was no turning back. They filed in, illuminating the dark corridors of the warehouse. At first, it truly looked like an abandoned building. Dust, old boxes, rust on the walls. But they only had to walk a little further to realize something was wrong. fresh drag marks on the floor. New electrical cables ran along the walls over old structures. Someone had been using the place. The first major revelation came when they found an iron door camouflaged behind rusted shelves. The access was secured by reinforced locks, but the firefighters managed to force it open. On the other side, a concrete staircase spiraled downward, plunging into the bowels of the basement. The smell of mold and rusted metal grew stronger, mixed with an almost indescribable odor of confined bodies. Rebecca felt her throat close, but she continued down. Upon reaching the bottom, the scene they encountered seemed like something out of a nightmare. Narrow corridors stretched in various directions, lit by dim lamps hanging from the ceiling. Lined with iron doors, some with small bars, they revealed what had been hidden for years. Children, dozens of them, then hundreds, sitting on the floor, leaning against cold walls, some with torn clothes, others so weak they could barely react to the staff's presence. The silence was broken by sobs and suppressed cries, which echoed through the cells like a chorus of suffering. Rebecca took a few seconds to process. Never in her entire career had she seen anything so brutal. Michael filmed in shock, barely able to hold the camera steady. The firefighters tried to open the cells, shouting instructions to each other. But panic was inevitable. With each broken door, new children emerged, many of them unable to stand up on their own. Some screamed in different languages, revealing they were not just from the region, but from far away. It was a global network, operating beneath the feet of an entire city without anyone noticing. The scene descended into chaos. Children cried, people ran through the hallways, firefighters carried small, fragile bodies in their arms. Rebecca tried to remain calm, organizing the rescues, but inside she was shattered. When she held one of the girls, too thin for her age, she couldn't hold back the tears. It was as if each of those victims were Daniel. The void left by her son found a cruel answer. She had never been able to save her own boy, but now she had the chance to save hundreds. The firefighters' radios began to crackle with urgent messages. The noise of the operation had attracted attention, and it wouldn't be long before someone connected to Harper arrived. It was a race, against time. Every minute inside that underground hell was a risk, but no one backed down. Rebecca shouted orders, Hayes filmed frantically, and the firefighters opened door after door, freeing lives that for years had been buried alive in silence. When they finally emerged from the basement with the first dozen children, the sky was already beginning to lighten. The contrast was devastating. The world above, calm and indifferent, welcomed back children who had been forgotten in the darkness. Makeshift ambulances arrived to provide first aid, and neighbors began to gather, shocked by the seemingly impossible scene. Rebecca, covered in dust and tears, looked back one last time, knowing there was still much more to be done down below. But in that instant, amidst the chaos, a certainty dawned on her. What they had just discovered wasn't just a rescue. It was the exposure of a monstrous network operating under everyone's eyes. And though the emotion of the moment was overwhelming, deep down, Rebecca knew that this victory would only be the beginning of an even greater war. Because if so many children were here, how many more could be elsewhere, hidden in silos, warehouses, and hallways she hadn't yet reached? The silence after the rescue seemed deafening. The chaos underground had turned to screams, running, and flashlights flickering in the midst of desperation. But when the children were finally out of the warehouse, the world seemed to stop for a few seconds. Rebecca stood, motionless, watching the small bodies being placed on makeshift stretchers covered with thermal blankets and given water and words of comfort. Her face was lined with exhaustion, sweat mixed with tears, and her eyes fixed on each child who passed. It was as if the weight of all the years of searching, all the closed doors, and all the accumulated pain had exploded all at once. Families began arriving in droves as the news spread. Fathers and mothers who had buried hope years ago now ran toward the ambulances, some breaking down upon being reunited with their children, others kneeling on the ground when they realized they hadn't yet been called. The air filled with tears, cries of relief and also of pain. There were hugs that seemed to never end, but there were also lost looks of those still unsure if they would be as lucky. Rebecca watched it all in silence, unable to intervene, because she understood that this moment wasn't hers. It was their reunion, the collective catharsis of a tragedy finally exposed. Michael Hayes filmed every detail, and it was impossible not to see his trembling hands holding the camera. He himself wept as he recorded the scene, but he knew these images were living proof that the truth could no longer be buried. The firefighters, for their part, were exhausted, but they kept running back and forth, carrying children in their arms, improvising bandages, offering words of comfort that sounded frail compared to the horror they had all witnessed. Rebecca knelt beside Emily, her neighbor now trembling in her arms. The girl was weak, her eyes lost, but she still recognized the familiar presence. When she whispered, "Aunt Becca," in a nearly muffled voice, Rebecca felt her heart shatter and mend at the same time. It was as if she had regained a piece of herself. There, amidst screams of despair and suffocating hugs, she found the only solace that truly mattered, a life that could still be saved. But even in the face of that catharsis, Rebecca knew nothing would ever be the same. The children would carry invisible scars forever. Many of them no longer knew what it was to play, what it was to live outside a dark cell. That rescue, however grandiose, did not erase the years of silence, hunger, and fear. And she herself, even as a savior in the eyes of the community, would also carry new scars. The void left by Daniel did not disappear. On the contrary, the children's rescue brought back even more powerfully the memory that she had failed to save her own son. As she watched the families reunite, Rebecca took a few steps back and fell silent. She didn't want the spotlight. She didn't want the recognition. She had fulfilled her role, but the emotional cost was too high. She stood, arms crossed, watching the sunrise behind the warehouse, and in that moment, it seemed as if each ray of light carried both relief and pain. A few firefighters came up to her and thanked her for her courage, but Rebecca simply nodded, unable to respond. Deep down, she knew nothing she could say would be enough to convey the magnitude of what had happened. She looked back at the ambulances, at Emily surrounded by paramedics, and let a tear fall uncontrollably. It wasn't weakness. It was simply the weight of humanity still resisting within her. Her silence said more than any speech. The entire country would soon know the story. But in that moment, in the middle of a dirt road, crowded with emergency vehicles and weeping parents, what mattered was the life that was beating again, even if marked by scars. Rebecca took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and when she opened them, she seemed to have made a silent decision, because behind all that emotion, a shadow still lingered, that the network that made it all possible had not been completely destroyed, and that thought would not let her rest any time soon. In the days following the rescue, Elmswood went from being a small town forgotten on the map to the epicenter of a tragedy that spanned the globe. Reporters, cameras, helicopters, and authorities from all levels crowded the narrow streets. The warehouse, previously treated as just another abandoned building, was now surrounded by fences, yellow tape, and armed security guards. But for Rebecca, none of that mattered. The collective catharsis had already occurred, the reunions had been televised, and the national outcry gave the case the visibility it had always been denied. But inside her, there was only silence. Rebecca stayed away from interviews, declined heroism awards, and avoided the spotlight. He spent most of his time at the hospital, visiting the rescued children. Many still couldn't speak, others had constant nightmares, and some wouldn't even eat. Rebecca looked at them with a mixture of pain and pride. I knew I had saved lives, but I also knew no one would emerge from that experience intact. Not them, not her. With each visit, Daniel's memory was inevitable. Her son had never returned, but those children now had a second chance, and that was the closest thing to redemption she would get. Michael Hayes, the journalist, insisted that she give a public statement, but Rebecca always refused. What else could she say? The images already revealed everything. What no one knew was that while the country was in shock, she was isolating herself. Sometimes she sat alone in absolute silence, staring into space, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was none. Because, behind all the relief of the rescue, there was also a growing shadow, the certainty that David Harper was still out there. The man who seemed untouchable, who presented himself as a pillar of the community, had not been arrested. No direct evidence linked him to the captivity. He had disappeared the same day the warehouse was raided, and to that moment, no one knew where he was. This consumed Rebecca almost unbearably. She had seen it in his eyes at local events, felt his presence, lurking beneath every clue, and was absolutely certain of his guilt. But Harper was a well-protected ghost. With no evidence, no witnesses willing to speak, he remained just a respected missing businessman in the eyes of the law. To Rebecca, this wasn't justice. It was merely a continuation of the farce that had always covered up horrors like this. One cold morning, weeks later, Rebecca walked to the cemetery where Daniel was buried. He carried a single flower in his hands, his footsteps heavy, as if carrying all the faces he had seen in the warehouse basement. She stood before the headstone for long minutes, saying nothing. She just breathed deeply, trying to hold back her tears, until she finally laid the flower on the ground and whispered softly, "I couldn't do it with you, but I did it with them." It was an intimate outpouring, without witnesses, just between her and the memory of her son. When she pulled away, her face held a look of relief and pain, strength and exhaustion. Rebecca knew her life would never be the same again, and though she had saved so many children, she still bore scars that would never fade. Scars that would remind her every day that this story wasn't over, because while Harper was free, the network he commanded could be reorganizing, ready to act again in some other forgotten corner. She climbed into the car, glanced in the rearview mirror at the city that now breathed hope but still hid untold secrets, and let a thought slip silently. The truth can be buried for years, stifled in dark cells and stifled by corrupt authorities, but one day it always finds a way to come out into the light. And deep down, Rebecca already knew that this wouldn't be the last time she would have to descend into the darkness to bring someone back. This story showed how the truth can be hidden for years and yet find a way to surface, and I bet that in some way you felt that weight and catharsis along with me. It was intense, full of twists and turns, and if it kept you hooked until now, it's because it brought answers, emotions, and that butterflies in your stomach feeling that only real stories, told the right way, can evoke. That's why now you can be part of this movement. By liking and subscribing to the channel, you help more people have access to these narratives that deserve to be told. And to show that you've reached the end of this journey, leave the word "I'm sorry" in the comments. True. The next video is already on the screen, and I can guarantee that the story will move you even more, because if today we saw how hidden pain can finally be revealed, in the next one we will delve even deeper into mysteries that remain unanswered. And believe me, you won't want to miss what comes next.